Time now for Conservative Party grandee Jacob Rees-Mogg, a distinguished MP for more than a decade. Jacob was Business Secretary, of course, under the ousted Liz Truss until October, and a senior cabinet minister under Boris Johnson before that. He's now on the backbenches, but remains one of the most popular Tories among both colleagues in Parliament and the Conservative grassroots, who, let's be honest, feel betrayed after the anti-democratic coup to impose Rishi Sunak as PM. So after a tumultuous year for the Tories in government, I'm delighted to say he joins me now. And Jacob, well, I mean, it's hard to believe when you look at where Boris Johnson was this time last year, fighting back against the health establishment, saying, no, we will not lock down despite all of that pressure. Because you will remember, you were in the meetings last year, Sage wanted to lock us down again. He's not in power. Can you get your head around sometimes the fact that the Tories seem to commit this gross act of self-harm?
It's absolutely fascinating looking at it as a political commentator rather than as an active participant. It's not just the Tory party, but if you look at the three most charismatic leaders post-war, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair and Boris Johnson, and they're all decapitated by their own parties. And it's very hard to understand why, because all three of them were exceptionally good at winning elections. They had, and in two cases still have, a very vibrant charisma that gets their message across in a way that others can't. I mean, both Tony Blair and Boris Johnson appealed to the other side's voters in a way that normal leaders don't. And yet the parties decided to get rid of them. And I think it was a very eccentric decision to get rid of Blair and an even more eccentric one to get rid of Boris Johnson.
And can we just talk for a moment about the Conservative Party members? Because we have a lot of them who watch this show. And they feel very betrayed about what happened a couple of months ago. They were given no vote. There is now a real move amongst the establishment of your party to actually remove their democratic right forever. There's Lord Peter Cruddas has set up this new organisation, the Conservative Democratic Organisation, backed by Priti Patel. Do you back this organisation? What do you think is going on in your party?
I strongly back the right of Conservative members to vote for the leader of their party. And party members should tell their association chairman not to vote to change the rules, because the rules cannot be changed unless the chairman of individual associations agree to it. And they should refuse, because it's not the party members who got it wrong, it's members of Parliament who got it wrong. It's members of Parliament who defenestrated Boris Johnson. It was members of Parliament on their own who got us to Theresa May, which wasn't our most successful experiment in leadership. So I would strongly defend their right. I'm worried that the increase in the membership fee that is proposed, taking it from £25 to £39, will see a decline in members. And then people may say, well, we haven't got so many members now, so they shouldn't have the vote. I think that would be a very bad argument. And if democracy is a good thing, which as Conservatives we think it is, it should apply within the Conservative Party as much as in the country at large.
How did we end up with Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor? Because it feels like there's been some sort of anti-democratic globalist coup to me.
Oh, I wouldn't be too conspiratorial about it. Jeremy Hunt is a very intelligent, capable man.
But he wasn't wanted by the party.
He wasn't wanted to be leader by the party, but that doesn't mean that people don't respect his abilities. He's a thoughtful, considered individual. I'm not pretending I agree with him on everything or that I would have chosen to make the decisions
he made. Because remember, he wanted a second referendum. He also was an advocate for a zero-COVID Chinese policy.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that he gets everything right, but none of us get everything right.
Pretty big things to get wrong.
But he's accepted the referendum result. He's made it clear as Chancellor he won't do anything to undermine Brexit. Well,
given that briefing to the Sunday Times the other week?
The Swiss kite was flown and was shot down pretty swiftly and resiled from pretty swiftly. And he's embraced the economic opportunities of being out of the European Union. He said that quite recently. So he is a big figure within the Tory party. And I wish him well. We need to have a successful and strong Chancellor of the Exchequer. We need a good and calm government, and I hope that he can be a part of that.
It just felt to me like Liz Truss never was given a chance. The establishment, the media in this country, and sadly, a lot of people a lot of Tory MPs were not prepared to respect the democratic vote by Tory members.
What's the line about the fault lies not in the stars but in ourselves? That I don't think it's any good when something has not worked to blame conspirators or to blame third parties. For a number of reasons, it didn't work. Some were luck, some were judgment. That is always the way. Do I think that much of what Liz was trying to achieve is a good thing to achieve, that we need economic growth? Yes, absolutely. But it didn't work. I think the greater mistake was getting rid of Boris Johnson and the efforts to remove him, which had no democratic mandate. And I think the mandate is important. Boris Johnson was endorsed both by members of the Conservative Party and by the British electorate. And it's very difficult for a government without that mandate to take bold decisions. And that is an issue that Liz faced and, of course, Rishi Sunak now faces.
Is Boris's political career still alive?
Oh, yes. He remains one of the biggest figures in British politics. You should try and organise this. You should try and walk down high streets in England with a variety of British politicians, and you will find the only one that everybody wants to come up and speak to is B. Johnson Esquire.
Yeah. No, indeed. I've seen that.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
It is. He is a political phenomenon, and maybe, Jacob, you are going to need him to stop this coalition from hell, a socialist coalition from hell, which we're envisaging of Starmer, the Lib Dems, Sturgeon and the Greens, because actually that is going to be disastrous for Britain. If it is a straight choice, because the thing is, right, Sunak might be a great guy. He has not moved the polls at all.
They've moved a bit, actually, and he outranks Sir Keir on the economic competence, which is an important test for Conservatives. But you're quite right, Boris has an added zest and charisma over other political figures. And you're also quite right that a coalition of people who haven't been voted for, the great virtue of first past the post is that the party with the biggest number of votes gets to choose. Now, if that's Labour, fair enough. That if it's the Liberals, it'd be unlikely, but fair enough, the party with the most votes ruling. But if you have a grubby coalition and you get Nicola Sturgeon pulling the strings after her lack of success in Scotland, or you get the Lib Dems insisting on electoral reform to try and keep them in perpetual power, that would be very bad constitutionally and very bad for the country.
No, indeed. Now, look, I want to talk about a couple of political hot topics on the agenda. And actually, I've been really heartened by Sunak over the past couple of days. I said at the top of the show, it feels like maybe he's trying to channel his inner Iron Lady and actually stare down the unions, which is really necessary, isn't it? Because if he backs down here, they know they've got him. He's got to hold firm.
Governments have to govern. The Ted Heath question of who governs was answered resoundingly by the electorate. So if you don't know, clearly not you. And it is important to ensure that you don't give in to every gust of wind. And it's interesting that the railway workers, some of whom turn out to be extremely well paid. We start reading about signalmen who get over £100,000 a year, train drivers £59,000 a year. They are on strike in a way that seems to me and to most voters to be completely unjustifiable, led by a really hard left, rather aggressive figure who seems to have been dug up from the 1970s Labour Party conferences. We're waiting for him to start talking about composites and comrades. And that has lost public sympathy, and I think that's changed the mood around strikes. And the ambulance drivers going on strike, I think people in absolutely crucial public services have a responsibility, as the police and the armed forces, who obviously have to stand in when other people go on strike. They should not be doing it.
But it's morally wrong, isn't it? It's morally wrong that tomorrow, here in the UK in 2022, a heart attack victim, a stroke victim in certain areas of the country could be left lying on a floor for 8 hours. That is morally reprehensible that the unions are allowing this.
Well, look, I think most ambulance drivers are good people, and they will find it very difficult to follow their union bosses in that way. I also think it's very odd that we've been told that we mustn't do things because we mustn't take any risks, that the NHS is there for the country, not the country there for the NHS. all of us being told, it's like COVID, we've got to adjust our behaviour for the convenience of the NHS cannot be right. The NHS must fulfil its obligations.
Rishi avoided the question today at the liaison committee, but Dominic Raab said it was on the table. Does the UK need to leave the ECHR to actually have any hope of stopping the votes?
My view of this is that there isn't a majority in Parliament for outright leaving the ECHR, but there probably is a majority for doing what was done over the prisoner voting rights.
And ignore them.
And ignore them and face the ECHR and the Council of Europe with the reality that this is an intrusion into British domestic policy too far, and that we are simply going to do something slightly different, that we will observe people's human rights under our understanding of them. And the greatest protection of our human rights is not a court outside the confines of this country, but is our own democracy. British people will not vote for a government that doesn't have proper standards of behaviour and proper concern for human rights. But the Rwanda scheme is a perfectly fair, sensible, well-legislated for scheme, and we should go ahead with it. You know, it's been reported, I mean, I don't know this as fact, but it's been reported that the injunction, which isn't really an injunction and other countries ignore, from the European Court, was given by a Russian judge who was apparently in a bar when he gave it. And that's overriding. That's overriding an act of Parliament.
Yeah.
And the British courts. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Speaking of outrage, the New York Times are calling for the dismantling of our monarchy in a really egregious opinion piece overnight. Have Harry and Meghan done real damage to our international reputation with this Netflix documentary?
I don't think any of my constituents read the New York Times. I don't care what the New York Times has to say. It's not an influential paper in the United Kingdom. It's not very influential in the United States anymore because it's become a hard left organisation that, according to Donald Trump, peddles fake news. So why should anyone fuss about the New York Times? As regards Duke and Duchess of Sussex, I wish them well. But what I'm concerned about, what I hold very dear because it's so much about the nation, what I think of as the nation, the symbolism of the nation, is the monarchy. And that is not affected by subsidiary members going on various television outlets or whatever else they do. I don't think that really matters. It's not a concerning issue.
No, indeed. And look, I just wanted to end by playing a great moment from Channel 4 News a few weeks ago. This is when you, let's say, called out their presenter for some obvious bias live on air. Let's have a look at this.
EU that make us inefficient.
Have you seen today's
We must
poll?
really be getting on with that.
I mean, it suggests that people have changed their minds.
Well, we had a referendum, and this is a bit like the Scottish question. Those of you who lost, and I include you in that category after your comments to Steve Baker, those of you who lost are very determined to have another referendum. You're just like Nicola Sturgeon, quite honestly.
Well, we'll leave that for another conversation. My comments had nothing to do with politics or policy, I assure you.
Have you apologised for them online? Do you want to apologise on the air for them? Because I think that's important. Good.
I have apologised, Mr Rees-Mogg, and he's accepted.
Oh, good. That's important.
Now, he apologised because he was caught, obviously, and without wanting to necessarily pick specifically on Christian Guru Murthy, but it was a terrible thing. He called your former colleague, Steve Baker, the C word, live on air. There's a problem with much of our media, isn't there?
Well, it is as it is. I actually think highly of Christian. I think he's a capable journalist. He's an interesting thinker, but he is as political as GBNews is. And I think why I like GBNews so much, it's clear that you're political, whereas some other outlets pretend that they're impartial. Of all the people I was interviewed by when he was still interviewing, I thought Jon Snow was one of the best and fairest interviewers, in that he would give a socialist as tough a ride as a conservative. But Jon did not have conservative views. And I thought he managed to get it right by not hiding his views, but by being very fair when you were being interviewed. not everybody is as good at doing it as Jon Snow was.
No, definitely not. Jacob Rees-Mogg, great to have you.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Have a very Merry Christmas. Thank you
Merry Christmas
so
to you
much.
too.